Welcome to Notepad. I'm your host, Ibrahim Sani. As promised, we are now returning back to normalcy and we're looking at restarting Malaysia. This is a mini-series that we're starting for this English belt on Consider This as well as on Notepad as we try to see how we can turn back to normalcy. Yesterday we talked about some industries on tourism and many others. Today we are talking about the tech sector as per usual of this show. Normally during this time every year we would venture out into the Silicon Valley area and perhaps even descend upon the WWDC. It is a developers conference by Apple where they gather the top and brightest minds as well as some silly minds like myself over to discuss some of the key projects that they are doing. Last year, some of the big things that WWDC was presented was, of course, the iPad OS, Watch OS, the integration between Swift and also the desktop and iOS products as well. And along the way, we've seen some developments, interesting developments, and now we want to ensure that this continuous march on progress is going to be continued. One of the key and brightest minds that we have, of course, in this part of the world is Stephen. He is, of course, a scholar of Apple, and we want to get in touch with him and see what he has been up to for the past year and perhaps look at how things are going to be done this year. Because if you haven't gotten the memo, WWDC 2020 is the first time that Apple is going to do the convention via online or virtual. And of course, this has never been done before. And people are excited about the whole notion of this being virtual. And of course, the audience is now global because everything is just going to be made accessible via people around the world. So joining me, of course, is Stephen. Thanks, Stephen, for taking the time to speak with us. How has things been? Let's get in touch with you with the COVID environment first. How have you adapted for the past 2 months or 3 months following the COVID pandemic scare that we are all experiencing right now?
I think in terms of how developers work together during this COVID, I think it doesn't really affect a lot because in terms of communication, it doesn't affect a lot, but in terms of communications with the clients or like maybe to people external of the companies, it does affect because it's very hard for you to communicate. So that's the impact that we all have to face. But for developers, the impact is less because in terms of internal, we are used to working. Some of the companies actually work remotely, full remote, so there's no physical office at all. So in terms of effect and impact to the developer is quite minimal compared to many other industries that we can see around, not only in Malaysia, but also around the world.
Prior to starting this interview, we touched a little bit about you interacting with your colleagues and all that. How has that changed, or how is that going to be changed moving forward?
I think moving forward, a lot of the things is going to be more black and white instead of like communication, because we used to be a lot of like verbal communications, verbal agreement and stuff like that. But I think going forward, a lot of the stuff would have to be written down black and white, and we call it documentation. So there will be documentations on like a specific website or like a black and white, because everyone has to refer to it and there's no verbal. I mean, we can't look into like personal communications between you and another colleague. So I think moving forward, there'll be a lot more black and white written on like a website or like a documentation blog for developer to actually move forward more efficiently.
Which I think is kind of needed, but was not looked at before. Black and white is important for any documentation. Okay, let's get in touch with WWDC 2020. How has things been since last year until now? Have you guys been developing something interesting?
I'm actually working on machine learning projects with my professor in my university. And so that's still ongoing. But on a more personal level, I'm actually looking into if I was supposed to go into continue my studies or if I should actually just join industry and do some like actual industry work.
How's that going to work out for you? Because universities are rethinking about how they admit students, at least for this year. Normally the intake is in the summer. How do you plan to work this one out?
In terms of how the classes are being conducted, because my university is Monash, so I'm not sure about how other universities work. But for our university, everything is already online. So actually before the COVID, the classes or the lectures are already pre-recorded. So in one way or another, you can actually attend or without attend the lecture, you can still get the same information. So the impact for COVID to our classes and our university is quite minimal. Maybe just the discussions with the lecturer, you need to actually arrange a special consultation session. But other than that, I don't see there are a lot of impacts to our daily learning activities. Maybe the only thing that I miss is the communications and the interaction with my classmates and the students, but I think that's fine. I mean, we are all working on it, so I think that's okay.
Yeah. All right, let's go back to what you're building right now. Machine learning is, of course, a key highlight feature of last year's WWDC. It's going to get enhanced this time around, especially things around COVID-19. But one thing about WWDC is that there's a carnival-like atmosphere at San Jose where people go there, they intermingle, and they share ideas, they strike up conversations with people they've never met in their lives and continue on these kind of interactions later on after they return back to wherever they came from. This kind of environment might not be the same anymore for WWDC 2020. How do you think you're going to marry that kind of experience doing things online this year versus the things that you've been experiencing over the past few years at WWDC where you can actually interact face-to-face with developers all around the globe?
Right. I think it's actually a silver lining to this because my personal opinion is that this is actually a very good thing because first thing first is I don't think this virtual thing is going to go on forever. So my personal belief is that this WWDC, one thing, whether you like it or not, is going to go back to like physical interactions like Carnival because that's the most efficient communications. But of course, no one can predict for sure, but this is what I think. And then the second thing is, like you mentioned, the Carnival-like thing, but then that is also a disadvantage to it because the number of participants is very limited. But whereas for this time, if it is virtual, so that means every single one of us, whether you're in Malaysia or you're in some other countries, you can still join this WWDC, whether you are just a normal developer student or you are someone from big companies like Facebook or like Instagram. So I think this is a very great chance. So I think more students should actually take advantage of it while it is still possible to do so in 2020 because no one is sure what's going to happen in 2021. So that's my take of it.
Okay, let's talk a little bit into the specifics of DubDub. The key highlight last year was, of course, Swift and some of the upgrades within that programming language. It's using more natural languages. People can now build with a preview live on the side. Has those kind of developments actually helped you in building whatever you're doing right now?
Yes, it definitely does help. But I think in terms of helping, I think it actually helps a lot more when it comes to designer to actually prototype their products because designer used to be not so good in coding or maybe because they are not supposed to know how to do coding. But with the new Swift UI, it's actually a lot more intuitive for them to do the coding. So it's not expecting them to do the coding, but they can actually see what they are planning to do the design, and then they can actually interact with it instead of using just 2D or maybe some 3D software to actually see just an image, but now they can actually interact with the design that they have in mind, and it's actually very simple for them to actually prototype it. So I think that's the advantage. We can actually get the insight from the designer and not only just the programmer.
Yeah, this is the part where there's a reason why they did this last year because they want to get the technical people and the non-technical people to actually understand each other. They've been talking to each other for the longest of time, but they don't really understand each other. Do you think that there's some use cases or test cases that you can share with us where this actually happened, where the designers actually understand the nature and the need and limitations of the language or the coding process, but at the same time, expressing their creative thought to make sure that the user experience can be attained as per what they wanted in the first place?
Yeah, definitely. So one of the example is because when it comes to design, so there are certain elements it's very hard for you to show, like even using a normal 2D design, because the conventional way is you have multiple 2D images and then you link it up one to one another, and then you just show to the developers how this works to the other page, and then this go to another page. But whereas like now, like I mentioned just now, so it's very straightforward. So the language Swift UI is a lot like simple language, but of course it's a bit more complex compared to English language, but it's very manageable. To be fair, it's very easy for you to learn. So when you know that language, it doesn't have to be even perfect. So you can actually just output one single page, and then you can show directly even to the clients like how this is going to be like, and they can make the changes in real time. So I think that in terms of communication, that helps a lot, more effective and more efficient. And also in terms of cost, it actually reduces the cost because you now do not need to have multiple pages or multiple pictures just to show a simple concept. But now you can just code it out and then a very simple prototype, minimal product, and let the programmers or the engineers to finish up the actual product, the polished one.
Some of the developers I've spoken to over the past year, they were talking about the processor needed as well. It seems like there's no additional need for RAM and additional need for hardware improvements to actually make this work. How has the user experience been for you? Do you think that your computer programming requirements have increased or it's about the same, or even because of the efficiency, you don't need that much firepower in your hardware?
In terms of hardware requirements for development, it's the same, so you do not need any additional new hardware. But whereas for the software and the phone, the device itself, so you need to actually be on iOS 13 because it's still new. This Swift UI is a new framework, new platform. So the older iOS is not supported. But of course, there are some limitations because they are still user on older iOS. But the situation is a lot better because iOS users tend to upgrade a lot faster their iOS versions compared to other platforms. So it's still going to take some time before we can actually see mass adoption, but I think it's moving into a very good direction in terms of how user can actually use it. Because in fact, actually several years old device can still use iOS 13, so I don't think there's any problem going forward.
Yeah, we're still talking about over 500 million devices around the world running on iOS 13, so that's still, an ability for you to actually catch that catchment area. Steve, we'll take a short break. When we come back, we'll continue on our conversation with you on WWDC. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back. We're with Stephen. He is a scholar of WWDC or WWDC that is happening virtually sometime in June. This is, of course, a step that is taken by Apple to ensure that there is no mass congregation of human beings in one place. This is the first time it's been done so. And this is where a bunch of developers around the globe is now descending upon their desktop and laptop and mobile devices to actually meet each other virtually to talk about the developments of the developing world of Apple. Stephen, of course, is joining us. Thanks, Stephen, for staying on the line with us and not running away. Stephen, we want to talk a little bit more about the migration between desktop or macOS, macOS 10, Catalina, and so on, versus the integration with the mobile devices, whether it's the watchOS, iPadOS, or the iOS. How has the bridge been between building applications across the platforms? Because it was displayed to us last year that it's supposed to work seamlessly. Has it been working seamlessly, at least for you?
In terms of technical perspective, yes, it is, because let's say an example would be if you are developing for a Mac OS or an iPad OS. So in order for you to actually support both platforms, there is actually not much requirements or effort from the developers. So all you need to do is just to make sure you tick the box to actually compile or build it for both Mac OS and iPad OS. And also, because if some of the audience might know, there are certain sizes might be different between Mac OS and iPad OS or even iOS. So that also has been taken care of by Apple, like some of the frameworks and the platforms that have been really newly released, for example, like Swift UI. But even if it's not Swift UI, there are a lot of new platforms that have been natively supported by Apple to actually ensure the integrations and the ease of use for the developers to build for both platforms. So it's not much efforts required from the developer as much as we would initially expected it to be.
Some of the things that we want to talk about is also some developments on COVID-19. We've seen Android working closely together with a lot of mobile developers as well to build contact tracing devices, apps, trying to find ways to actually improve on the ability for authorities to track and trace, but at the same time ensuring that privacy is going to be attained. That's for the Android guys. And of course, Apple has announced something similar along the way. Do you think that this we're going to see a lot more track and trace kind of environment or public safety or public health kind of solutions being built in line with the COVID scenario that we're facing right now?
You're right. So I think we're definitely going to see some privacy-based technologies in this coming WWDC, because from what I noticed since 2 years ago, there's always been a privacy trend towards the development of Apple technologies. So, for example, the WWDC 2019, they actually released on-device machine learning. So it's actually very related to like COVID-19 tracings and the user privacy issue that you mentioned just now. Because the good thing about on-device machine learning is because the conventional machine learning is you always need to send it back to somewhere at the center base to compute the data or the user data. So when the data actually leave your iPhone or your phone or your device, so there is always a chance for it to be compromised, no matter how safe is your software, stuff like that. But whereas now Apple released on-device machine learning, so that means the user data will not actually even leave your device itself. So to say it in a normal human language way, so even if I develop the app and you use my app, but then I will still not be able to access your app, but my app will still be able to use whatever data that you have to do machine learning and provide some more tailored and more personalized information and recommendation to you based on the fitness app.
Yeah, and of course, as you say, everything is contained within your device. The issue here is how do you bridge that gap between what user tries to understand with what you guys are building, because sometimes user might not even understand the risk that they are putting themselves in, and how do you ensure that the users are fully aware of the privacy concerns that surround them without using these kind of solutions, but try to understand a little bit better about what the solutions might provide them, and it might be good for them actually to adopt these kind of new applications.
So in terms of the user, so I don't think user would actually need to worry too much if I'm talking about like Apple's platform. So
yeah.
For example, if you are using an iPhone, for example, so usually you do not need to actually understand a lot more about like what I mentioned just now about on-device machine learning, because these things are supposed to be for software engineers. But from a software engineer perspective, explaining to a consumer, I would say because App Store have a very strict regulation, so not all the apps submitted by the developers will actually be approved. So from the App Store, they will actually go through and review your apps. And also another thing I want to mention, because like a lot of the COVID tracing and COVID statistics apps, they are actually not being approved unless you are from a government authority or like some actually certified authority. So there is itself in already an authorization from the local community itself. So I think that's a very not technical way to explain about this kind of technology.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about your solution, the one that you're building right now, because we early on in the interview touched upon machine learning. How do you think you will approach WWDC this year and try to understand what you can learn from this year to continue and build and strengthen the solutions that you're building right now?
The solutions that I'm building right now is more towards based on how we can improve the architectures of the software. So it has a lot to do with how developers build their work and structure their software. So in terms of the WWDC, because this year is going to virtual, so the audience is a lot larger, there will be an opportunity to meet more engineers. So from a more human perspective, I think being able to actually communicate more with other engineers, because there will be more engineers this year as virtual WWDC, I think that is the most advantage things that I can get from the WWDC, because at the end of the day, I think whether you are doing a machine learning project or just a normal project, I think you should actually consider and think based on from the viewpoint of the user, which in this case will be the developer. So I think being able to meet developers from different sizes, like different sizes company, like Apple engineers or even engineers from like a normal developer company. So I think that's the thing that is going to help the most, in addition to whatever that is actually being put forth and available for the Apple's technology. Because there's one thing I do want to highlight, because the technologies or the new API, or the new technology released at Apple at WWDC, it is eventually going to be released on the website, and the documentations and everything would be on the website as well. But the most valuable thing is actually the interactions with fellow engineers, so you can understand more from their perspective.
All right. We'll take one more short break before we conclude our conversation with Stephen. Don't go anywhere. You're still watching Notepad. I am still with Stephen. Let's talk about some of the trends that are moving forward for this year. Stephen, we know that machine learning is important, AI, but there's also many others, right? From sports and fitness, from healthcare, which is extremely timely to talk about in this time of age. But there's also, payments system, financial technology, fintech. There's also robotics. How do you see all these various mega trends are going to be developed, or at least going to be talked about in WWDC this year? How do you think Apple will approach this and try to entice the developers to jump on the bandwagon if they haven't already, and try to enlarge these kind of mega trends even further for this year?
So one thing about the AR technology that you mentioned just now, augmented reality. So the pain point has always been that developers or just any big companies could not find an actual use case. So the AR technology is there, but we could not find an actual convincing use case for the consumer to use it. But because of the situation right now, a lot of people are working from home and we can't actually go out. So that is actually a very good opportunity for the Apples, or it's not only Apple, but developers in general, to actually take advantage of this scenario and actually to push their augmented reality apps and applications. For example, it has already been there for quite a few years. Like if you see, there are actually a lot of like apps selling their products using augmented reality. And a very good example would be you can actually see and feel the product of like iPhone using augmented reality. If you are using an iPhone, you can actually see what's new with the new phone. So the same can be done with like furniture or any sort of product. So there's a very good way for us to push for augmented reality, because eventually I think there will be a virtual reality, but virtually that reality might not be coming so soon, because you need a specific hardware. I mean, you don't expect all consumer to buy a VR glasses, but for AR, you actually just need to use your phone, and most of the existing phones are supporting the AR. So I don't think that is going to be an issue for consumer to adopt, especially with the current situation.
What would be some of your messages for Malaysians who might be interested to actually sit in and watch WWDC for the first time ever? What would be some of your messages to them?
I think the most difficult thing on a personal level would be you have to beat against your bio clock, because it's going to be midnight when the WWDC is going on. But I think all developers should actually take, like I mentioned during this interview or this conversation, they should actually take more advantage of interacting with other engineers, and not because some of my observations are the engineers tend to be too focused on the technology itself. I mean, it is a good thing, but I think a more important thing and a more valuable thing that you cannot miss is you have to communicate with other engineers, because like I say, the technologies, they will eventually be available on the documentation, but what you cannot get is by learning from the experience of other engineers who might actually be coming from big companies that in the Silicon Valley, and so we can learn from them.
Yeah, and the opportunity is always there. Again, we have to draw this conversation to a close. Hopefully, when we look at WWDC and maybe see how the things develop, then we'll touch base again, at least for a short bit after the WWDC is over. That was Stephen. Of course, he is an Apple scholar. We talked about this last year as well, right, Stephen?
Yeah, it was supposed to be, I think, last year, slightly earlier, because last year WWDC was around early of June, so it was maybe early of May.
And it's been a pleasure speaking to you. I am pretending to try and understand at least half of the things that you say. But of course, generally speaking, that is the idea of WWDC. You can watch the WW live on all the Apple platforms. Of course, on this station and in this show, we will be covering it extensively over the next few weeks. Stay tuned to all the developments and the updates that we are going to be bringing you. I'm going to be watching WWDC myself and we'll be commenting on it live as the days go by. That's it from me for this particular episode. Remember to continue to watch us on all your mobile devices. You can download the Astro AWANI app wherever you get your devices. Until then, thanks very much for watching and goodbye.